The gender-neutral dollhouse. Child Protective Services investigator Thomas Walsh arrived at my house on a Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. And the first thing he saw in the living room was my son, Andrew, 52 years old, senior VP of marketing, Yale class of 94, sitting in a giant eggplant costume, drinking coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal. The room was entirely gray. There were no interior doors. Walsh looked at Andrew, then at me, then back at Andrew. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "Mrs. Collins," he said finally, "is that your son?" "Yes," I replied. "He's demonstrating biological neutrality. The eggplant is the most gender-neutral object across 47 surveyed cultures. I have a comparative chart." It hadn't always been like this. 3 months earlier, this house had doors, a burgundy sofa, and 18 porcelain dolls. My biggest problem was finding time to apply a fresh coat of varnish to the stair railing before the grandchildren arrived. My husband Robert built the dollhouse in 1954, the year we married, while we were still renting a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Hartford. He was a cabinet maker of the old school, the kind who feels wood through his fingertips, who hears how it breathes through the seasons and shifts under the blade. The house was 4 stories tall, with real hinges on the wardrobe doors, tiny brass locks on the windows, and a 3rd-floor balustrade carved finer than a pencil line. Robert spent 6 months on it, evenings, weekends, every spare hour, while I read beside him or cooked in the kitchen where I could hear the quiet rasp of his plane. When he died 12 years ago, that dollhouse was the most important thing he left me. Not photographs, not letters, the house. Because every detail of it held his hands, his patience, his particular way of loving, through things he made slowly and meant to last forever. I restored it every 5 years, repainted the interior walls, replaced the curtains, tightened the hinges when they worked loose. I collected the dolls my whole life, 18 pieces, porcelain and bisque. The oldest was German, made in 1890, with a hairline crack across her wrist. I found her at a Berlin flea market when Robert and I traveled through Europe for our 40th anniversary. He haggled for her in English, with a German accent he didn't have, and the vendor finally gave in just out of bewilderment. I had lived with those dolls in my Connecticut house, the house Robert and I bought in 1961, and I had never intended to sell it. My son Andrew grew up in this house. He climbed the apple tree in the backyard, left a notch in the kitchen door frame checking his height every summer, and at age 8, knocked the German doll off the shelf and cried longer than I did. I glued her wrist back together with porcelain adhesive, and the crack remained, a fine line, barely visible if you didn't know where to look. Andrew knew. When he grew up and became a marketing executive in New York, he would still visit that crack during his trips home, touching it with one fingertip, as if verifying it was still there. Then he married Brittany, sharp, energetic, 40,000 Instagram followers, and very firm opinions about how the world ought to be arranged. They had 2 children, Finn, age 5, and River, age 3. Good kids. Finn could sit beside me for half an hour without moving while I worked to brush, just watching. River grabbed anything that glittered and immediately tried to dismantle it. When Andrew called in November and said he and Brittany wanted to stay with me for 6 months, "Just while the market settles, Mom, it's insane out there," I was genuinely glad. The house was big enough, the rooms were there. I put a star-shaped nightlight in the children's room and bought new pillows. I imagined morning breakfasts, Finn in the workshop, the kind of household noise Robert would have liked. I didn't think about what it meant that the move also included Brittany, all of Brittany, with her views and her account and her iron conviction that the surrounding world was in urgent need of improvement. The first 2 weeks were almost good. Finn found the workshop on his very first day. I gave him an old plane with no blade, and he was completely content. River discovered the doll in the pink dress on the lower shelf of the cabinet and pressed her to her chest with an expression that made something tighten in me. I told her she could hold the doll while they were here, as long as she was careful. River nodded with all the gravity a 3-year-old can muster and pressed the doll tighter. The first warning came quietly. Brittany walked into the living room, saw River with the doll, and stopped. Something tightened almost imperceptibly around her eyes. "River, sweetheart," she said, voice perfectly level, "put the dolly down. Remember our talk about toys like this?" River looked at her mother, then at the doll, then reluctantly held it out to me. Brittany gave me the particular smile that meant we're both adults here, we understand each other without words, and left the room. I stood at the cabinet and watched River follow her out, glancing back at the doll over her shoulder. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I was wrong. That same evening at dinner, Brittany talked about her new project, a series of posts about creating inclusive spaces for children. She spoke with genuine enthusiasm, gesturing with her fork, and I could see she wasn't performing for my benefit. She believed every word. That, I would come to understand, was what made this so difficult to navigate. Andrew spread butter on his bread with the expression of a man who has heard this particular speech not for the first or the 20th time. "Gender-coded toys are the first thing that has to go in any child's environment," Brittany said, winding spaghetti around her fork. "They literally program children into binary perception of the world. The research is very clear on this. Pediatric development studies going back to the 70s. "Mom makes dolls," Andrew said neutrally, not looking up from his bread. A brief pause, the kind that has a shape to it. "I know," Brittany replied, her smile remaining perfectly in place. "It's very sweet. It's just not the best influence for the kids. There's a difference between appreciating craft and exposing children to objects that reinforce gender essentialism before they've had a chance to develop their own sense of identity." "They're porcelain dolls," I said. "Exactly," said Brittany warmly. "Female presenting, passive, decorative. That's the whole problem in miniature." I looked at my coffee. "The oldest one is from 1890, I said. Her name is Charlotte." "Objects don't have inherent value just because they're old," Brittany said, not unkindly. "Actually, that's sort of the whole argument. We keep inheriting things without questioning what they're actually telling us." Andrew had put his bread down. He wasn't eating now, just sitting. I recognized the posture. It was the same one he'd had as a teenager when Robert and I disagreed about something at the table. Arms folded slightly, waiting for the weather to pass. I said nothing more. The coffee in my cup was bitter and slightly cold. Outside, the November garden was going dark. I looked into it and told myself that people say things they don't always mean, that enthusiasm runs ahead of action, that she would move in, settle, and the urgency would soften. I was still capable of convincing myself back then. The following week, Brittany asked me to move the dolls out of the living room. "Just while we're here, Mom, it's not permanent." I said I'd think about it. 3 days later, she asked again, this time with Andrew present. He studied the floor. I looked at my son, at the boy who had cried over a mended doll, and said I'd think about it. I didn't move the dolls. I still thought this was only words. The list appeared on a Friday morning. I came downstairs at 6, as usual. On the table sat a printed page, neat, bulleted, left aligned. I picked it up. My hands were dry and steady. The coffee hadn't finished brewing yet. The house was quiet, except for the refrigerator humming in the corner. Items requiring reconsideration in a child-inclusive living space. Item 1. The dollhouse. Gender-coded object reproducing a patriarchal family model through spatial organization. Item 2. The porcelain doll collection. Objects imposing a femininity narrative through appearance, dress, and passive role. Item 3. Children's books with illustrations depicting characters with pronounced gender markers. Item 4. Pink and blue household items in child-accessible areas. Item 5. Any toys or decorative objects containing binary representations of gender, family, or social roles. At the bottom, a paragraph. We understand this is your home and these are your belongings. We are asking you to consider removing or replacing the listed items for the psychological safety of Finn and River. If this is not possible, we may need to reconsider our arrangement here. I read the list twice. Then I folded it in half and set it beside the coffee maker. Outside, the sky was lightening. Gray, November, no promises. Bile rose in my throat, hot and metallic, and I took a long swallow of coffee to push it back down. I thought about Robert, how he would show me each new detail as he finished it. The tiny balustrade, the staircase with its real treads, the window glass he'd cut from a sheet of mica. How he looked at me when I said it was beautiful. 6 months, every evening after work. Andrew came downstairs at 7:30. He sat across from me. The list lay between us. He picked it up, unnecessarily, since he clearly knew what was in it, and put it back down. "Mom," he started. "Was this your idea?" I asked. "Ours," he said, too quickly. "Andrew?" A pause. River woke up behind the wall and called for her mother. He raised his eyes, and I saw in them what I'd seen in his childhood when he'd broken something or skipped his homework. Not malice, but a mixture of awkwardness and the hope that everything would somehow resolve on its own. "Brittany has done a lot of reading about this," he said, looking past me. "She genuinely believes it matters, that environment shapes children. This isn't against you, Mom." "Your father spent 6 months on that dollhouse," I said evenly, "every evening after work." "I know. Do you remember coming to watch when you were little?" "I do. You'd sit on the stool and not say a word for an hour." "I remember. And you understand why I can't just put it in the garage." He was quiet. He stared at the table. He stirred coffee he hadn't poured yet, a habit I recognized from his boyhood, a way of buying time when he had no good answer. "Mom, it's just for a few months," he said at last. "When we find our own place, everything goes back to the way it was." "The way it was," I repeated. "Yes." I looked at my son, at the width of his shoulders, which came from Robert, at the way he held his head when he was thinking, which also came from Robert. "When you married Brittany," I said, "you called me at 2 a.m. You said she was extraordinary, that she was the first person who'd ever made you feel completely understood. Do you remember?" "I do." "She is extraordinary. I'm not disputing that, but this is my house, and that list is asking me to throw out the last thing your father made with his hands." A long silence. River's voice rose behind the wall, increasingly emphatic about something. Andrew rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, please, just give it some thought." "Give me a week," I said. The relief on his face was so immediate and so visible that it was almost painful. He nodded and left. I sat at the table with my coffee and the neatly folded list, which lay precisely where Brittany had left it, aligned to the edge, corner to corner. Everything she did had that quality. I had to give her that. That same night I called Eleanor. She was a retired attorney, a woman of iron logic and zero patience for other people's nonsense. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, a few seconds passed in silence. "Dorothy," she said at last, "do they understand this is your house?" "Formally, yes." "And in practice?" I looked at the dollhouse on the shelf. "Apparently not." "Then explain it to them," she said. I asked her to specify the method of explanation. After a pause, she made a short sound. "That's either brilliant or a disaster." "Or both." Eleanor laughed. "I give it 50-50, but if you've already decided, do it." I had already decided. That same night, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, probably until 2 in the morning. The tea went cold. I didn't drink it. I looked out the window at the dark garden, where the apple tree was just a shape in the November black, the tree Andrew had climbed as a boy. I remembered one particular evening. Andrew would have been about 12. Robert was finishing a chest restoration for our neighbor Martha, working in the shop those evenings. Andrew came in and sat beside him without any reason. They were quiet for about an hour. Robert worked, Andrew watched. Then Robert handed him the plane and showed him how to hold it, the same way I would later show Finn. Andrew made one pass along the board, then another. The shaving came off uneven. "That's all right," Robert said. "Again." By the end of the evening, it was better. Andrew went to bed without saying anything. Robert put away his tools, washed his hands, and said to me in the kitchen, "Good boy." Just that. Nothing added. I thought about that boy and how he had grown into a man who studied his shoes while his wife made lists. I suppose that isn't so strange. People adapt to the ones they love. That isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it is. I stood up, poured the cold tea down the drain, and went to bed. The weekend I spent online, reading the sources Brittany cited in her posts. It was educational. I was particularly interested in a paper arguing that any visual division of space into private and shared zones reproduces hierarchical patterns inherited from patriarchal social structures, and a study on chromatic neutrality in children's environments. The argument that interior color carries culturally embedded meanings that influence identity formation. I took notes. By Sunday evening, I had a folder with 18 tabs. It was the best use of the organizational skills I had developed over 40 years of restoration work. Monday morning, Brittany asked if I'd made a decision. "Yes," I said. "You're completely right. I've been blind to it. This house is full of hidden hierarchies I never thought about. If we're going to live together, I need to fix that." She opened her mouth, closed it, smiled. "I'm so glad that you," she began. "Don't worry," I said. "I'll handle everything myself." I took the doors down that same afternoon while Brittany was at the coffee shop with her laptop. I called my neighbor James, 50s, handyman, a man who asks no unnecessary questions if you pay promptly. "Which doors?" he said. "The interior ones." A pause. "All of them?" "All of them." Another pause. "Including the bathroom?" "Including." The separation of space into private zones reproduces hierarchical patterns. I have a paper. James looked at me. $200. Deal. Brittany came back at 5:30. I was in the living room with a book when I heard her come through the hall. And stop. A long pause. Footsteps toward the bathroom. Another pause, longer than the first. Then she appeared in the doorway. The doorway because I'd had my door taken down as well, and stood there. "Dorothy," she said carefully, "where are the doors?" In the garage, I answered without looking up from my book. Why? I raised my eyes. You said yourself that spatial division reproduces hierarchical models. I found the article in the Journal of Critical Pedagogy. You linked it in March. Brittany opened her mouth, closed it. That was about children's rooms, she said at last, her voice carrying a new edge I hadn't heard before. The article didn't specify, I replied and went back to my book. Andrew came home at 7, saw the empty frame where the kitchen door had been, and stopped with his coat still in his hands. Mom? Come in, we're discussing the concept of neutral space. He looked at Brittany. She was looking at me. I poured everyone tea. At dinner, Brittany explained to Andrew, carefully and at length, what had happened. He started to speak several times and stopped. Finn asked where the bathroom door had gone. I explained that doors restrict movement and create artificial barriers. It's actually easier, River reported, returning from investigation. But what happened the next morning, I hadn't anticipated. Brittany was in the kitchen before anyone else, before even me, which was rare. She was sitting at the table with her laptop when I came downstairs. She closed it, quickly, but not quite quickly enough that I didn't notice she had closed it. Good morning, I said. Good morning, she replied, and then she poured my coffee before I could reach the machine. A small thing, something that took a second. She had never done that before. I noted it, said nothing. The furniture came next. I'd bought the burlap in advance, a full roll, good weight. I worked all morning, neat and methodical, tacking it with a staple gun. The sofa, the armchairs, the coffee table, the sideboard in the dining room. When Brittany came downstairs at 11, the living room was entirely gray. I handed her the chromatic neutrality study. Color carries culturally embedded meanings, I explained. I don't want the children to absorb my sofa as an expression of hegemonic aesthetics. She took the paper, read it, looked up. Dorothy, she began carefully, I appreciate that you're trying to understand our values, but there's a difference between principles and literally, I'm not trying to understand, I said pleasantly. I already understand. Would you like some tea? Andrew called during his lunch break. Mom, what's happening? I'm creating an inclusive environment. You upholstered the sofa in burlap. Color imposes cultural narrative. Mom. Brittany explained it very clearly. A long pause. Mom, please. Have a good workday, sweetheart, I said, and hung up. Over the next 3 days, I worked systematically. I removed all the mirrors except the one in the bathroom. Mirrors encourage narcissistic self-perception based on gender-specific beauty standards. I sorted through the library and set aside every book with illustrations of characters wearing clothing carrying gender narrative. The stack reached nearly to the ceiling and included a very good Italian cookbook, a gift from Robert. I moved it to the workshop. The workshop itself I left untouched. That was my territory. Then I found the right paper. It was a real article from an actual journal, a fairly specialized one, about gender semiotics in representations of the natural world. It contained a section on the eggplant, not quite in the direction I needed, but close enough to work with. I printed the relevant pages, added a few citations from other sources, highlighted the key passages. That evening, I set the packet in front of Andrew. What's this? He asked, looking at the stack. A study on gender neutrality in natural forms. Of 47 surveyed cultures, the eggplant is the most biologically neutral. No pronounced gender markers in shape, color, or cultural associations. I put down a second sheet and a comparative chart. Andrew looked at the chart, then at me. then at Brittany, who was at the stove making a show of being busy. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked finally, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man already suspecting he won't like the answer. "Because I've ordered a costume. It arrives Thursday." The silence became absolute. Even the stove seemed to stop bubbling. "Mom," Andrew said very quietly. "Sweetheart," I replied in the same register, "you've said yourself that children absorb everything from the adults around them. If you want them to grow up without gender stereotypes, you need to model neutrality yourself. Otherwise, words and actions don't align." He opened his mouth. "There's a comparative chart," I added, pointing to the sheet. Brittany turned from the stove. For the first time in the whole conversation, she looked not at me, but at Andrew. And in that look, I caught it at the edge of my vision, was something I hadn't expected. Not outrage, not solidarity, curiosity. She was watching to see what he would do. That was when I should have understood everything. The costume arrived Thursday. Professional quality from a theater supply shop, good padding, proper shape, fine purple fabric, a little green stem cap. I'd guessed his size correctly. "This is a joke," Andrew said. "This is a decision," I replied. Brittany said nothing, and that silence was different from her usual silences. "You can't make me wear that," he said. "Of course not," I agreed. "But then we're applying different standards to different members of the household. Children notice inconsistency." This was nearly a direct quote from Brittany's post in September. I could tell by her expression that she recognized it. And again, that same look, directed at Andrew rather than at me. She was still watching. Andrew put on the costume the following morning, silently, with the dignity of a man who has made a decision and intends to maintain it. River, when she saw him, laughed so completely that she slid off her chair. Finn studied him with the expression of deep concentration he got when classifying a new phenomenon. "Is Daddy an eggplant?" he asked finally. "Daddy is demonstrating neutrality," I explained. "Oh," said Finn, and returned to his oatmeal. The next 10 days were the most enjoyable I'd had in months. Every morning, Andrew appeared at breakfast in the eggplant, silent, increasingly grim, but he appeared. I removed the floor lamp. Directional light creates hierarchy between illuminated and unilluminated spaces. Replaced all the towels with identical gray ones. Brittany objected each time, first heatedly, then methodically, then with mounting desperation. Each time I heard her out, nodded, and presented a printout. One confrontation after another, she lost to her own words, and I watched it wear her down. But I still didn't understand the main thing. I understood it on a Wednesday evening entirely by accident. I came downstairs for water around midnight. In a house with no interior doors, sounds traveled differently, more clearly, and heard voices from the kitchen. I stopped in the hallway. Andrew and Brittany were speaking quietly, but in the night silence it was enough. "This has gone too far," Andrew was saying. "We need to talk to her properly." "I tried talking to her properly," Brittany answered. Her voice was calm, too calm for midnight after a week in a gray room. She gave me a reading list. "She's doing exactly what we're doing." "Yes," said Brittany. A pause. "So what do you suggest?" Andrew asked. "Nothing," she replied. "I'm watching." I stood in the dark hallway a moment longer. Then I went quietly back upstairs, drank water from the bathroom tap, and lay down. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. She was watching, which meant she had a plan, or one was forming, and what I'd thought of as my game might also have been hers. In the morning, I acted as if nothing had changed. At breakfast, Brittany was the same, composed, measured, phone in hand. Andrew ate his oatmeal in the eggplant without speaking. Finn announced that today was talent show day at school, and he planned to demonstrate proper plane grip. Nobody objected. I poured everyone coffee. The day moved along. The following week, on a Thursday morning, the doorbell rang at 10. I opened it to find a man holding a folder. Mrs. Collins, Inspector Thomas Walsh, Child Protective Services. We received a complaint. I stood in the doorway and looked at him. Something rang in my ears, steady, quiet. A complaint. So that was what she had been watching for. That was the plan. "Please come in," I said. I brought him to the living room, where Andrew was sitting in the eggplant, in the gray room without doors. Walsh set his folder on his knee and opened it. "We received a report that the environment in this home may be potentially traumatic for children." He surveyed Andrew, the gray covers, the empty door frames. "Is this your home?" he asked me. "Since 1961, I replied. "Can you explain the situation with the doors?" "Of course." I produced my folder, mine with 18 tabs. The division of space into private zones reproduces hierarchical patterns inherited from patriarchal social structure. Here's the paper. Walsh took it, looked at Andrew. "And the furniture?" "Chromatic neutrality. Color carries culturally embedded meanings." Second sheet. Walsh took that too. "And the gentleman?" A pause. "That's my son. He's demonstrating biological neutrality through the image of the eggplant, the most gender-neutral object across 47 cultures. I have a comparative chart." Walsh closed his folder, opened it again. I offered him tea. "Who recommended these measures?" he asked carefully. "My daughter-in-law," I said simply. "She's very passionate about inclusive parenting. She has an Instagram account. I can give you the link." Walsh looked at Andrew. Andrew was looking into his mug with the expression of a man who wished it were large enough to hide in completely. "Is all of this voluntary?" Walsh asked. "I'm the homeowner," I said. "I can do as I see fit in my own house." "Of course. And the children, they're all right?" "Fine. River says it's actually easier without the bathroom door. Finn is working on logical consistency." Walsh spoke with the children. Finn came in and shook hands, which he had apparently decided was the right thing to do when meeting official visitors. He sat down across from Walsh and answered questions with the directness that only 5-year-olds and certain lawyers can achieve without effort. "Do you like staying here?" Walsh asked. "Yes," Finn said. "There's a workshop." "Is it strange without the doors?" Finn considered this. "A little, but Dad said it's important." Walsh glanced at Andrew. "Your dad, in the—" he indicated the eggplant. "Yes," said Finn. "He's demonstrating something. I don't remember what." "Neutrality," I offered. "That," Finn agreed. Walsh wrote something in his folder. Then River arrived, assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds, announced that she wanted a cookie, and left when informed there weren't any. Walsh noted something else. Brittany appeared at 10:30 and stopped in the doorframe when she saw us sitting together over tea. "You're Inspector Walsh?" "Yes. I'm the one who called. You can see what's happening here." "I can," he agreed. "Your mother-in-law explained the concept of neutral space to me, in considerable detail. 18 tabs. Brittany looked at me. Something new moved through her eyes. Not anger, closer to respect alloyed with fury, which aren't the same thing but sometimes look identical. "Dorothy," she said through her teeth. "Yes, dear?" I replied. "You can't use my own words against me." "I'm not against you," I said evenly. "I'm for consistency." She looked at Walsh. "Surely you can see that this is—" "Mrs. Collins," Walsh said carefully. "The environment is unconventional, but the children appear healthy, engaged, and well cared for." He paused. "I would ask that the bathroom doors be rehung for basic sanitation and privacy purposes." He looked at me. "Can we agree on that?" "Absolutely," I said. Brittany stared at me. The rest, Walsh continued, capping his pen, appears to be a family matter. This should have been the end of it, but what happened that evening changed everything. Brittany went to her room right after lunch and closed the door. Andrew had taken off the eggplant and was lying on the sofa, in burlap, but still. I was in the workshop tending to the German doll. Her left arm had begun to separate along an old seam. The workshop was untouched. The dollhouse stood in its place, the dolls on their shelves, the tools along the walls in the order I'd established 30 years ago. It was the only room in the house where nothing had changed. I worked and thought. I reinforced the seam with a brush, short, precise strokes. My hands knew what to do. It's good when hands remember. My mind was free for other things. I thought about how, over 3 months, I had done everything right. Methodical, consistent, documented, and still ended up with a Child Protective Services inspector in my living room. Which meant I had miscalculated something, which meant Brittany's logic was separate from what I'd been seeing from the outside. And that logic had led her to call CPS, not out of malice, but out of some internal consistency I hadn't fully accounted for. She genuinely believed she was right. That was harder than a simple adversary across the room. I thought about what she'd said that night. I'm watching. Walsh's final report arrived in the mail 2 weeks later. Environment is unconventional, but no evidence of threat to the children's physical or psychological welfare was found. Situation constitutes a family conflict over domestic norms. No further monitoring required. In the notes section, written by hand, father of the children was present for the interview in an eggplant costume, voluntarily. In the evening, Andrew knocked on the workshop doorframe. He came in, sat on the stool beside the workbench. He didn't say anything for a while, just looked at the shelves the way he had as a boy, cataloging things, taking inventory. Mom? Yes? Brittany called CPS. He said it flat, like a fact he was still deciding what to do with. I know. You knew? No. But when I opened the door and saw the inspector, I understood. A pause. He reached out and picked up the small, spare brass lock from the dollhouse, a piece from the last restoration, sitting on the corner of the bench. He turned it in his fingers. I didn't know she was going to do that, he said. I believe you. It was wrong. Yes. She said she did it because she was worried about the kids. He was still looking at the lock. That you were creating a traumatic environment. I set down my brush, wiped my hands on the work cloth, and waited until he looked up. Andrew, I need you to hear something. He met my eyes. I created for your children exactly what your list created for me. The same thing, precisely. The feeling that your home is no longer your own, that the rules change without warning, that you wake up not knowing what will be wrong next. The only difference is I chose it deliberately. They didn't. I paused. And neither did I until you handed me that paper. The silence that followed was a long one. No sound in the house except the refrigerator and the wind moving through the bare branches outside. Andrew looked at the lock in his hands. I do, he said at last. Quietly, genuinely quietly, not the way people say things when they want to end a conversation. Then talk to Brittany, I said. Tonight. Really talk. He nodded, set the lock back on the table, got up. In the doorway, he stopped. Mom, I'm sorry. I looked at his back, broad shoulders that came from Robert, the same tilt of the head when he's thinking. Go on, I said. That night they talked for about 3 hours. I lay in my room and heard the voices, not the words, only the shapes of them. At some point, Brittany's voice broke, not from anger, from something else. Then it went quiet, completely quiet. The kind of quiet in which either everything ends or something begins again. In the morning, Brittany came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. She stood at the window, same linen blouse, same posture, but something around her eyes was different, tighter and quieter at once. "I want to talk," she said. "All right." She was quiet a moment, finding her words. For the first time, I saw her do that, look for them, since they were usually ready. "You did all of this on purpose." "Yes." "You understand that it was manipulation." "Yes, so was the list." She pressed her lips together, looked at the window. "We were worried about the children." "I know," I said, and turned to face her. "You love those children. That's not the question. The question is that you came into my house, where I have lived for 63 years, with a printed list of demands. And item 1 was the dollhouse Robert spent 6 months of his evenings building. He came home from work, had dinner, and went to his shop every night for 6 months. When he died, I didn't frame a photograph of him. I didn't keep his watch in a box. I kept the thing he made with his hands. That's what you put on the list." I poured her coffee and set it in front of her. "I know you didn't mean it that way. I know you were thinking about the children, but you didn't ask me what it meant. You printed a list." A long pause. The refrigerator hummed. Upstairs, River's feet shuffled across the floor. "I called CPS," Brittany said, not looking up from her mug. "That was wrong." "Yes." "I thought—" She stopped. "I convinced myself it was about the kids. Maybe some of it was, but some of it was because I was losing the argument and I couldn't stand it." I sat down. This was more than I'd expected her to say, and I respected it. "The argument," I said carefully. "Which one?" "Every argument," she looked up. "You used everything I believe against me, every single thing, and I couldn't touch it because the moment I objected, I was being inconsistent. You had me perfectly." She wasn't angry saying this. She sounded like someone examining a problem with reluctant admiration. "Where did you even find that paper about the eggplant?" "Journal of Ethnobotanical Semiotics," I said. "June 2019. She stared at me. Then something in her face shifted, moved towards something I hadn't seen from her before. "You're a very smart woman, Dorothy." "I know," I said. "So are you." That was the problem. She looked at me for a moment. Something crossed her eyes. Not quite a laugh, but the direction of one. Not a smile, but close. I poured myself more coffee. Outside, the first pale light was coming into the garden, and the apple tree stood exactly where it had always stood. "I'm sorry about the list," she said finally. "Not about the ideas, but about the list, the way we did it." "I know," I said, "and I'm sorry about the bathroom doors." She almost smiled. Actually, almost. "Just the bathroom doors?" "The mailing address for the burlap was also perhaps excessive," I said. She did smile then, small, reluctant, real. "The burlap was excessive," she agreed. They left a month later. They'd found a rental in Stamford. That last month was different. Brittany stopped issuing directives. Andrew would come into the workshop sometimes and just sit. We rarely spoke about what had happened. Only once, when I took the burlap off the sofa, and Andrew said, "Thank God." And I laughed, and he laughed too, and it was the first time we'd laughed together in 3 months. The dolls stood on their shelves, and nobody said another word about them. On their last morning, Finn came to the workshop to say goodbye. He stood at the dollhouse and looked at it for a long time, touching the small brass latch on one of the windows with his fingertip. "Grandpa made this?" "Yes, the latch, too." "Was it hard?" "I imagine so." Finn traced the carved cornice on the third floor. I want to learn, he said. Come back, I told him. River said her goodbyes quickly. She was in the middle of a dispute with her father over a pink stuffed rabbit she wanted to bring. I slipped out, took the rabbit from her, went inside, wrapped it in tissue paper, and put it in her backpack while Brittany's back was turned. River watched the whole operation. She clutched the backpack to her chest and looked at me with her very serious 3-year-old eyes. I winked. Brittany was last out the door. She stopped and turned back. You're an unusual woman, Dorothy, she said. Thank you, I replied. She nodded and walked out. Andrew lingered one more second. Mom? Yes? He hugged me, quickly, tightly, the way he had as a boy when he came home from somewhere far away. Then he left too. I closed the door. The house was quiet. Good quiet. The right kind. What happened next, I hadn't planned. Eleanor called a week after they left. Have you seen your daughter-in-law's Instagram? I hadn't been following Brittany's account. No reason to. Eleanor read me the post. Brittany had written honestly, without lies, described everything. The eggplant, the inspector, the burlap. At the end, a call for intergenerational dialogue about inclusive values. The post got 4,000 likes. Then a conservative page reposted it. This is what it looks like when a grandmother fights back. That repost got 40,000. Other pages picked it up from both ends of the political spectrum. Within 3 days, Brittany was simultaneously a hero on progressive accounts and a target on conservative ones. A reporter from the local paper asked for an interview. She declined. That was wise. Eleanor laughed about it for a long time. I laughed less. I felt a little sorry for Brittany, not for what had happened, but because the weapon she'd chosen had 2 edges, and she hadn't checked the second one. In winter, my antiques dealer Peter Malloy called. He came in January, spent 2 hours in the workshop. He left an appraisal sheet. The German doll with the crack at the wrist, $22,000. The doll in the pink dress, the one River had pressed to her chest on that first day, $8,000. The collection entire, $160,000. The dollhouse he declined to value. Original work, one of a kind, historical significance, would need separate specialist assessment. I read the sheet twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer, next to the old photographs and the will. I didn't mention it to anyone. It wasn't necessary. Robert would have laughed. He rarely laughed, but when he did, really, until his eyes watered. In February, Andrew called. We talked about the children first, how things were going in Stamford. Then a pause. Mom, Brittany and things are complicated right now. I listened. She's good, she really is, but sometimes I feel like we're speaking different languages. Are you talking to her about it? We're trying. Good. A pause. Mom, do you regret it? What you did? I looked at the dollhouse on the shelf. Always there, always in its place. The brass locks on the windows, the carved cornice on the third floor. 6 months of evenings after work. No, I said, I don't regret it. But call Brittany and talk to her, really. Okay, he said. April came late, the way it always does in Connecticut. River's tulips came up after all, red, definite, no ambiguity. The ones she'd planted upside down had to be redone, but most of them managed on their own. I watched them from the porch with my coffee and thought I should write to Eleanor. In May, Finn came back, alone, for a weekend. He walked straight to the workshop and put down his backpack. Can I start? Start what? Learning. I gave him a piece of wood and showed him how to hold the plane, a real one, with the blade in, with the proper precautions. He worked slowly and with focus. At some point, he looked up at the dollhouse. How long did Grandpa spend on it? 6 months. Could I do that? I looked at his hands, small, with a good grip, at the shaving that had come off clean. Yes, I said, you could. That evening at the kitchen table, he drank hot chocolate and told me about his friend Oliver, who could whistle with 2 fingers, and about River biting a chunk out of Oliver's rabbit. The pink one? Yes, Mom doesn't know. He stirred his chocolate. Grandma, is the eggplant still here? In the closet. Can I see it? I brought it out. Finn studied it seriously, tried on the little stem cap. That's funny. Yes. Was Dad upset? Probably. But he wore it. Yes. Because you're his mom. I looked at him, 5 years old, entirely serious, hot chocolate around his mouth. Yes, I said, because I'm his mom. He nodded as if that explained everything and went back to his drink. All told, it did. Sunday evening, Finn stood in the workshop doorway with his backpack and looked at the shelves of tools for a long time, memorizing. I'll come back in the summer. Come back. And I'll practice. I'll be waiting. He nodded, deliberate and decided, and walked to the car where the nanny was waiting. He did come back, in July, for 2 weeks. Brittany called the night before, brief, businesslike. Dorothy, Finn wants to come to you. He's been talking about it all spring. I said I'd be glad to have him. A small pause. Thank you, she said. Just that, nothing added. It was something. Finn arrived with a backpack that held spare socks, a dinosaur book, and the bladeless old plane I'd given him when he left in November. He'd kept it all winter. We worked every day, 2 or 3 hours in the workshop before it got too hot. I showed him how to read wood grain, how to hear when the tool is tracking right. He was patient, the way Robert was. His hands had something of Robert's in them, the same hold, the same angle. I noticed it every time and said nothing. On his last day before leaving, he stood at the dollhouse for a long time, touching the cornice, the latch, the balustrade. Grandma, he said at last. Yes? If I make one, could it go next to this one? I looked at the dollhouse, at the empty space on the shelf beside it. Yes, I said, it could. I watched through the window as the car turned in the driveway. The red tulips in the garden swayed in the evening breeze, heavy, vivid, not gray in the least. The German doll with the crack at her wrist stood in her place in the cabinet, first in the row as always. I ran a fingertip along her. Cool porcelain, slightly rough at the seam. On the shelf beside her lay the small brass lock, a spare from the last restoration. A fine thing, good steel, remarkably light. I finished my coffee. For the first time in a long while, it wasn't bitter.